I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 12 Last Gasp. We last left off with the death of Constantine the Great. During his lifetime, he did more to change the appearance and destiny of Byzantium than any single person in history, so I guess it is fitting that it would now be named after him. Well, to be fair, there is another ruler that challenges him for the title of most transformative, but we won't get to talk about him for another 1,000 years. Upon Constantine's death, the Roman Empire was once again split among multiple rulers. This time, however, there were the underlying bonds of the Church to help maintain the continuity of imperial government. Before we get started on the narrative, I have a caveat to go over. This episode proved to be another tricky one to set boundaries for. In order to keep the podcast focused on Constantinople, we'll have to pick and choose what we talk about carefully. While both the history of the Roman Empire and the Christian faith are integral to understanding the history of Constantinople, it is all too easy to be swept up in these larger events and lose sight of our city. In an attempt to avoid getting lost, I will be covering important figures and events from the wider picture of history only as they touch our city. It will be necessary in some cases to discuss other less related parts of the stories in order to give context. I hope you can bear with me as I try to navigate this maze. Returning to the narrative, it was the later half of the year 337, and the city of Constantinople was in mourning. After 3.5 months of being laid in state, Constantine's body had just been paraded through the city and finally put to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Now the people waited to see what kind of ruler Constantine's son, Constantius II, would be. They would not have to wait long. As soon as his father was good and buried, Constantius went to the task of ensuring that his position was unassailable. To this end, he fabricated a post-mortem directive from his father stating that Constantine's brothers, by his father's second marriage, were responsible for his death. This letter sparked an orgy of blood that only ended when every male member of the royal family, apart from Constantius, his brothers, and 3 infant boys deemed too young to be a threat, were dead. With this nasty business completed, and the capital firmly horrified into submission, Constantius made his way to Sirmium, to meet with his brothers so that they could divvy up the empire. In 338, the borders were drawn so that the eldest brother, Constantine II, ruled in the west, from Spain to Gaul, and from the western Barbary coast to Britain. The youngest brother, Constans, held dominion over the largest portion of the empire that included North Africa minus Egypt, Italy, Illyria, Macedonia, the Danube, and Thrace. This gave him theoretical control over Constantinople, but he would soon be forced to succeed it to Constantius, who ruled over the eastern provinces. The arrangement between the 3 emperors would quickly break down, but for the time being, Constantius was distracted by his duties in the east. Upon returning to Constantinople, Constantius implemented a set of decrees, while not as revolutionary and transformative as his father's, that were a continuation of what his predecessor had begun. He built a medley of buildings, both of the practical and beautiful type. Among these were an expansion on the foundations of Hagia Sophia his father had laid, as well as infrastructure that needed to sustain the rapid growth of the city. While not as glamorous as the churches and hippodromes, cisterns, grain silos, and roads were nonetheless necessary construction. On top of these practical buildings, Constantius also staffed a retinue of bureaucrats to help govern the city. Constantine had been a notorious control freak, and so the governing infrastructure of the empire was short-staffed compared to what it should have been. Just like his father, Constantius sought to oversee the gradual disappearance of the pagan religion within the empire. In order to appear pragmatic, the young emperor took a middle-of-the-road approach to both Christianity and pagan policy. While it was still illegal to openly worship pagan gods, and doing so carried the death penalty, Constantius allowed for many pagan institutions to continue in the empire. So while temples were shut down and Christian iconoclasm was encouraged or ignored, the pagan schools and Vestal virgins remained a fixture of Roman life. In the case of the ongoing split in the Christian Church between the Arians and the Nicene Creed proponents, Constantius looked to embody a compromise position that only ended up pissing off both sides of the schism. He also embodied a continued persecution of the Jews within Roman territory, though interestingly, his policies did not target the ability of the Jewish people to worship. Rather, he sought to limit the economic viability of the followers of Judaism. He set a cap on the number of slaves that Jews were able to own, and made it so that any Christian that converted to Judaism had his property confiscated by the state. Constantius's religious policies may be controversial, but they were completely overshadowed by his successor, who we will be discussing soon enough. In the meantime, I want to note that Constantinople did not have the emperor's undivided attention. To the west, Constantine II had become disillusioned with sharing power amongst his younger brothers, and so he invaded Italy in 340 to take the 16-year-old Constan's territory for himself. This short expedition was a disaster for Constantine, and after only one engagement, he was dead. His body was unceremoniously thrown into a river, and Constans claimed the entire 2/3 of the empire for himself. Constantius was forced to acknowledge this arrangement, as he had been splitting his time between the capital and his de facto base of governance in Antioch. Constantius had moved to Antioch because the Persian Sassanids, under their king Shapur II, had begun a prolonged campaign of attacks on the eastern border provinces of the empire. These attacks continued for nearly a decade, until Constantius was finally able to repulse the Persians and establish a tentative peace. Returning to Constantinople, he would have no time to rest and admire the city that had, within less than 30 years, become one of the shining jewels of the Roman Empire. Constantius was once again torn away from the capital when his brother Constans was usurped and executed in 351. He quickly avenged his younger brother, and after defeating the usurping general, Constantius became the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire in 353. His solo rule would only last 2 years before he realized that the threats that his empire faced were too numerous for one emperor to handle alone. He needed help, and in terms of options, he had only one. Somewhat by the twists of fate, but mostly by his own hand, Constantius was left with only one male relative that he could promote to co-emperor. Constantine the Great had 2 half-brothers on his father's side. These were the victims of Constantius's purge at the start of his reign, but 3 of their sons were spared. Of these 3 sons, one had been killed by Constan's usurper after ruling in Rome for only 28 days. Another was promoted to Caesar of the East while Constantius dealt with the usurper, but his behavior caused Constantius to order his execution soon after. That left only Flavius Claudius Julianus, or Julian, as a viable option. Julian's father, Julius Constantius, had fled the imperial court after his brother, Constantine the Great, elevated Helena to the rank of Augusta. He knew that Helena resented the fact that she had been cast aside in favor of Julius Constantius's mother, Theodora, and so he spent the next few years in exile with his family. Upon Helena's death in 330, Constantine invited his estranged family back to Constantinople. As a consequence, Julius Constantius and his wife Basilina were in the city when their 3rd child, Julian, was born, making him the first emperor to be born in Constantinople. Unfortunately, tragedy seemed to follow the young Julian from the start. Only a few weeks after his birth, his mother died. When he was 5 years old, his uncle Constantine died, and Constantius the Butcher took the chance to murder Julian's father. Luckily for him, Constantius did not see the need to expand the bloodshed to his infant cousins, and so Julian was sent away from the capital to study and to stay out of Constantius's way. It was while Julian studied in the great Hellenic schools of the empire that he became exposed to Greek philosophy, which was taught mostly by Greek pagan scholars. This exposure would eventually lead to Julian disavowing Christianity and earning him the posthumous title, Julian the Apostate. But for now, Julian would be torn away from the books and teachers that he loved, as Constantius was in need of him after all. In 355, the no doubt surprised Julian was summoned to Milan, where Constantius bestowed the title of Caesar upon him, and put the young philosopher in charge of defense of the entire Western Empire. The appearance and character of Julian led many to not have very high expectations for the man now in charge of keeping the hordes of barbarians at bay. He was, to put it bluntly, a bit of an ugly duckling. He had a crooked posture and dour face that combined with his inarticulate way of speaking to create a distinctly non-imperial appearance. Julian would surprise everyone, though. For what he lacked in looks and experience, he made up for with energy and intelligence. Over the course of his first 4 years in office, he managed to subdue all the tribes that had troubled the western provinces for generations, and established a more enduring peace in those lands. While Julian was having miraculous success in the west, Constantius was sweating bullets in the east. After less than 10 years of peace with the Persians, the emperor received an ultimatum from Shapur, calling for him to renounce his claims on Mesopotamia and Armenia. Constantius could obviously never give these lands up without a fight, but he did not have nearly enough troops to face Shapur alone. And so, in 360, Constantius made a desperate plea for aid to his co-ruler, who now held court in the Gallic city of Paris. Julian was in a bind on what to do. Despite the fact that Constantius had elevated him to his prestigious position, he still hated him for the way he had butchered his family, so personally he did not want to help his cousin with the Persian problem. On the other hand, he was a ruler of the Western Roman Empire, and someday that might extend to the eastern provinces, should Constantius die before him, so Julian did not want to lose Mesopotamia and Armenia to the Sassanids. Ultimately, all these considerations were moot, as the decision to march east was not really Julian's to make. At the start of his tenure, the Western Caesar had promised his overwhelmingly Gallic legions that they would never have to leave their homeland to fight in far-off provinces. If he broke his word, it was more than likely that his men would execute him and choose a leader that more readily sympathized with them. Despite this threat hanging over him, Julian pondered and debated on whether to answer Constantius's call, until one day, the army marched up to his palace and demanded him to take the title of Augustus in defiance of his cousin. According to Julian, a divine sign from Zeus himself arrived at this moment to tell him to take the crown, which was offered by his men. It's more likely that the clever Julian knew that it was the crown or his head. When word reached Constantius of his cousin's betrayal, he seethed in impotent rage as he was pinned down in the east for the time being by his Persian adversaries. So the empire sat in uncomfortable suspension, waiting for the inevitable civil war. Finally, 4 years after Julian had been crowned Augustus, a break in the Persian campaign allowed Constantius to reorient his armies in Constantinople to prepare to march west. Rather than wait for Constantius to attack, Julian took the initiative and roused his routed Gallic legions and marched towards the capital. He hadn't even made it to Greece before a messenger relayed the news that Constantius had died of a fever and his legions had accepted Julian as sole emperor. Even though Julian hated Constantius for what he had done to their family, he put aside his personal feelings and honored the late emperor with an appropriate funeral. Constantius was laid to rest beside his father in the Church of the Holy Apostles, which was still precariously holding up its giant golden dome. This event would be the last time Julian the Apostate ever set foot in a Christian church, which would be a more dramatic statement if Julian's life had lasted more than 2 years after burying his cousin. Julian, of course, had no way of knowing that his reign would be so short, but his actions made it seem like he did. As soon as he took control of the capital, and by extension the entire empire, Julian implemented a massive overhaul of the imperial government. See, Julian's guiding principle was that the empire had grown weak under corruption, decadence, and a rejection of traditional Roman values. All these problems Julian blamed on Constantine in his embrace of the subversive Christian god. Never mind the centuries of decline the Romans had been undergoing during the reigns of pagan emperors. Julian sought a return to the empire's golden days by reinstituting paganism and purging all the superfluous and corrupt parts of the imperial bureaucracy. He decentralized the rule of the urban centers of the empire by placing responsibility back in the hands of local magistrates and reforming the tax system. However, he also centralized legal authority in the hands of the emperor. His idea was that the emperor should guide the realm by approving and enforcing just laws, but that he should be hands-off in the implementation of these laws, so that the bureaucracy would be more streamlined and flexible. The purging of most of the bureaucrats within the government meant that Julian had to fill these positions. He did not want to fill all the positions that had been made vacant, as he saw that the system had become bloated and unwieldy, so he hand-selected a few officials that were necessary for the running of the empire. One of the most radical changes that Julian made came at his own expense. His obsession with traditional republican values meant that while he did not want to abolish the role of emperor, he did want to dramatically change what it meant. He saw the emperor as first and foremost an administrator, and sought to tear down the deification of the position that had become so important to the people's image of what a ruler was. Julian believed the emperor should be first among equals, not equal to the gods. All this was done in the 5 months that he spent in Constantinople before heading east to the temporary capital of Antioch, which his predecessors had used when the war with the Persians was imminent. It was here in Antioch, rather than Constantinople, that Julian would really kick his campaign of repaganization into high gear. Antioch was a much more suitable place for such an undertaking, as Constantinople, along with bearing the name of the great Christian emperor, had too strong a Christian presence. Antioch, on the other hand, was a healthy mix of pagans and Christians. Julian's initial approach was two-pronged. First, he pardoned all Orthodox clergymen in order to reignite the inter-Christian civil war between the Arians and Orthodox. Then he repealed the ban on pagan worship so that the religion could once again flourish. In Julian's mind, paganism was the obviously superior religion, and so persecution wouldn't be necessary, as the people would gravitate towards paganism and away from the inferior Christian god. The usually perceptive emperor was completely wrong on this point, which he later realized when the response to these changes was complete apathy. Angry and probably a little bit embarrassed by his initial failure, Julian decided that maybe a little persecution was necessary to push people in the right direction. To this end, he instituted a sweeping declaration that completely cut the legs out from under the Christians. This declaration was that no one could become a teacher without approval from a local council that the emperor would choose. Without stating it directly, this meant that any Christian would be unable to become an educator, as in Julian's opinion, they could not properly teach the classical texts because they were written by pagans. This aggressive action against the church led to widespread demonstrations, which in turn led to the burning of a pagan temple, the closure of the great church of Antioch, and the deaths of a few Christians. The situation seemed likely to spin out of control when it was arrested by Julian, finally marching off to face the Persians on the battlefield. He would have to delay his confrontation with the Christians until he got back. But luckily for the Christians, Julian would return from this campaign in a box. By the time Julian left Antioch to face his fate, he had been in a position of authority for only 8 years, and sole ruler for less than 2. Facing off against him, King Shapur II had ruled his kingdom for 54 years, technically since before he was born, as he was crowned while still in his mother's womb. Despite this difference in experience, Julian was undeterred in his mission to prove himself to be the reincarnation of Alexander the Great, and not only stop the Persian advances into Roman territory, but conquer the whole Eastern Empire. Things started off well as Julian faced little resistance as he made his way all the way down the Tigris River, encountering only small bands of Persian soldiers until he reached the Persian capital. Outside the walls of the city, Julian earned a surprise victory against the defending garrison, which saw the Romans inflict 36 casualties for every one they took. Perhaps it is a bit ironic that Julian was stereotyped as a bookish intellectual at the expense of more manly attributes like bravery and battle prowess, when it was not a battle that defeated him, but logistics. After winning this stunning victory outside Ctesiphon, Julian could not follow through as he lacked the tools to breach the walls, and his army was stricken by hunger, flies, and disease. Wanting to press further into Persian territory, Julian was finally convinced by his generals that there would be a mutiny if they did not turn back for Rome immediately. Reluctantly, the emperor ordered the army to retreat to friendly territory. They only made it some 150 kilometers to the town of Samarra before Shapur caught them. The ambush was repulsed, but the cost was that Julian had neglected to wear armor while leading his men from the front, and a stray spear caught him in the liver. As the Persians retreated, Julian issued his last gasp of life, and paganism within the empire perished along with him. The apostate had only ruled the combined Roman Empire for a brief 19 months. Still, Julian captures the imagination of both contemporary and later historians. He is not treated very kindly by history, likely because it was mostly written by Christians who despised him, but even they cannot resist being intrigued by the possibility and potential of an extended Julian rule. Few emperors in history can match Julian's precise diagnosis of the structural problems that had weakened the empire for centuries. Even fewer had the energy and ambition to implement policies that could reverse the damage. Julian's first 5 months as the head of the empire indicate that it is quite possible that he could have led the Roman Empire into a new golden age purely from his administrative reforms. What makes this historical counterfactual even more interesting is the fact that he probably would have also undermined his own success with his fanatical obsession with returning the empire to paganism. As we have seen from his time in Antioch, Julian's perceptive nature had a huge blind spot when it came to religion. He could just not wrap his head around the fact that Christianity had too much momentum, and even those pagans that remained were not nearly as passionate as their emperor when it came to reviving their traditions. So maybe if Julian had returned from his expedition to Persia, the empire would have undergone a renaissance, but it is just as likely that Julian would have been assassinated by some Christian zealot, and the point would have been moot. Each person has their own reasons for why they like or dislike any figure in history, especially Roman emperors. But what intrigues me about Julian in particular is that he is a perfect example of the shortcomings of the great man model of history. In theory, Julian had the power and the talent to make the empire whatever he wanted it to be, but when he tried to turn back the tide of Christianity, he found that he was incapable of overcoming the force that pushed back. While each of us has the ability to shape the path of history, we are ultimately constrained by our material conditions. Whatever can be said of Julian, there is no doubt that he left his mark on the empire and Constantinople, despite his constraints. It's all fun and games for us to theorize alternative ways history could have gone, but for Julian's men, still trapped in enemy territory, there was no time to think about what ifs. Not only was the emperor dead, thanks to his cousin Constantius, all the male members of the imperial family were dead. Even though they hadn't produced any really bad emperors, the Constantinian dynasty that had shown so much promise had ended after less than 60 years. To replace Julian, the army elected the commander of the imperial guard, a relatively unremarkable man named Jovian. He would wear the purple for only a few months, but he did have two important contributions to make before bowing out. One was the humiliating peace terms he came to with King Shapur, which ceded large tracts of territory and important border fortifications to the Romans' rival. The other was a complete restoration of the religious freedom that had been proclaimed in the Edict of Milan, effectively wiping out all that Julian had attempted to do to curb Christianity and promote paganism. Having done his service to the realm, Jovian promptly expired in his sleep before even reaching Constantinople. This time, the army chose an even lesser known and even more unorthodox man to become the next ruler of the Romans. The son of a rope maker and a career soldier, Valentinian was not exactly what people first picture when asked to describe a Roman emperor. He was mostly illiterate, and to put it bluntly, a bit of a brute. It must have been quite a surprise to the people of Constantinople, whose last ruler had been the unattractive and nerdy Julian, when the handsome yet comparably dim-witted Valentinian strode into the city, adorned in the imperial purple. Once he was set up inside the capital, Valentinian appointed his younger brother, Valens, as Augustus of the East, while he himself would rule the West from Milan. Valens was even more of a brute, and not quite as handsome as his brother. While neither Valens or Valentinian were intellectually or temperamentally suited for the high office, they did bring a certain martial vigor that was useful during their reign. If there was one problem that weighed heavier on the minds of the everyday Roman citizen more than the economy or religion, it was the ever-present threat of foreign invasion. The two emperors had been soldiers for most of their lives, and they would take this experience with them as they spent the next 13 years fighting up and down the frontier in the Sisyphean task of protecting the border provinces from encroachment. But I think we have spent enough time outside Constantinople this episode, and so I want to go over the events that happened in the city after Julian died. Unlike his predecessors, Julian did not wish, for obvious reasons, to be buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, but instead chose the city of Tarsus to be his final resting place. Tarsus was a very ancient city with deep pagan roots that remained even in Julian's day. For its devout paganism, Julian preferred it to Constantinople, and even planned to make it the official capital of the empire after his trip to Persia. Of course, he never made it back to Tarsus, at least not alive, and Constantinople remained in its prestigious position. Possibly feeling slighted by Julian's rejection, the city officials later had his remains removed from Tarsus and buried next to the Church of the Holy Apostles as a final insult to the apostate. The city never got to thank Jovian for restoring Christian rights to the empire, as he died in Ankara in Anatolia, but they were happy to receive Valentinian and his brother Valens, who were, despite their violent nature, devout Christians. Of the two, we will mostly focus on the career of Valens, who ruled in the east from our titular city, that is, when he wasn't in Antioch or on campaign. In fact, it was while Valens was away on campaign to restore some of the losses suffered to Persia, when a man in Constantinople took the opportunity to steal the throne from Valens. This man was named Procopius, and he was a cousin of Julian, from his non-Constantinian side. Being this distance from the imperial dynasty meant that Procopius was safe from Constantius II's butchering of the male members of his family, but also close enough that he could secure a position in the royal court. Procopius was an effective enough administrator that when Julian purged the imperial bureaucracy, he retained his position. It probably didn't hurt that he was also related to the emperor. His experience and loyalty meant that, and according to some sources, Julian had named Procopius as his desired successor should he not return from Persia. As Julian retreated from the Persian capital, Procopius was on his way through Persia to reinforce him. He was unable to reach him in time, and when he caught up to the main Roman army, he had already been passed over in favor of Jovian. Procopius did not take this chance to press his claim, and decided to wait until they reached Constantinople, where his base of support was located. A wrench was thrown into this plan when Jovian died en route, and suddenly Procopius had to contend with two rivals, Valens and Valentinian. In order to shore up support and lay the groundwork for his coup, Procopius spent the first few months of the brothers' reign in Constantinople accentuating his connection to the still popular Constantinian family. He was always accompanied by either Constantia, Constantius's daughter, or her mother Faustina. All was going according to plan, as Valens made the unpopular decision to fire the popular minister Seleucus, who had actually been the army's first choice for emperor after Julian's death, but he had declined. Valens further stoked tensions by passing tax increases, which, though necessary for running of an empire, no one ever likes. Procopius's chance came in September of 365, when Valens marched his army out of Constantinople towards Antioch in preparation for war against the Persians. Procopius declared himself Augustus on the 28th of September, and Valens' immediate response was to consider abdication or suicide. He eventually came to his senses and sent a portion of his army back through Asia Minor to retake Constantinople and execute the usurper. These men, upon reaching the capital, immediately defected to Procopius's cause, allegedly due to the usurper holding the Constantinian family as hostages. Valens was forced to send another, larger portion of his army under more reliable commanders to crush the rebellion and further delayed his invasion of Persia. This new force chased Procopius's armies around Anatolia, until, after 8 months of pursuit, the twin battles of Thyatira and Nicolia saw most of Procopius's men defect and the usurper captured. The whole debacle ended in May of 366, when Procopius was executed and Valens was able to refocus his efforts on the foreign adversaries of the empire. The external enemy he would have to face first was not the Persians, but an army of 30,000 Goths that had invaded Thrace in hopes of aiding Procopius's revolution. When the Goths received word that Procopius had been executed and the revolution squashed, they decided to plunder the Thracian countryside. Normally, a barbarian invasion on the west side of the Bosporus would have been a job to delegate to a general, so that Valens could continue his campaign in the east, but these Goths were pillaging much too close to Constantinople in the imperial heartland to be treated like any other barbarians. So Valens personally marched back west and chased the Goths back over the Danube River. The emperor led his armies over the river and attacked the Visigoth kingdom that was allied to the invaders. Before a decisive victory could be won, the Goths retreated into the impenetrable Carpathian Mountains, and Valens was forced to return to the east when the Persians started getting restless. This is how Valens' reign would continue for the next 8 years, alternating between fighting Sassanids and Saracens in the east, as well as internal revolts in Asia Minor and Goths in the west. That left little time for administration and building in the capital, but Valens did make a few minor contributions to the city during his time. These included the baths of Carosa that he named after his daughter and a series of aqueducts, which were the longest system of water transportation in the world. In November of 375, Valens' brother died of a sudden stroke, leaving him the senior Augustus. It would take over a year for Valentinian's remains to reach Constantinople, where it would be laid to rest with the rest of the deceased emperors in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Now, the cause of Valentinian's stroke is often attributed to his anger after being confronted by an emissary from a tribe called the Quadi, who had recently invaded Roman lands and pillaged a large swath of land. The Quadi blamed the Romans for the invasion, which obviously enraged Valentinian, supposedly to the point that he just keeled over and died. But what was the real reason the Quadi invaded? After all, they had maintained relatively friendly relations with the Romans up until this point. The real reason was that the great crisis of the late Roman Empire had appeared on the horizon. The Huns had originated in Mongolia and swept through the steppes of Asia until they pushed up against the Gothic tribes on the border of the Roman Empire. These tribes stood no chance against the wild and insatiable horde, and so they were forced to make a choice. They could either stand their ground and face certain annihilation, or flee into Roman lands in hope of finding asylum among their traditional enemies. Neither choice was ideal, but the Roman option at least contained a glimmer of hope, and so the Ostrogoths were the first to petition Valens for resettlement in Roman lands. The emperor proved that there was more to him than what meets the eye, and that he was not just a simple brute when he allowed the Ostrogoths to enter his lands. Soon many other Gothic tribes would follow them, and Valens, from his headquarters in Antioch, gave explicit orders to his provisional governors to treat their guests with respect. Surprise, surprise, the governors were more interested in enriching themselves than respecting the Goths, and so they robbed the refugees and left them on destitute lands with no food or shelter. This decision was pretty short-sighted, as there were over 1 million settlers, 200,000 of which were hardened barbarian soldiers, and the Roman garrisons had been stripped to the bone in order to fuel the larger army in the east. So while the majority of Roman soldiers were bogged down fighting the Persians with their emperor in Antioch, the provisional governors of the imperial heartland continued to antagonize and brutalize the Goths that had greatly outnumbered them. In 377, the Goths had finally had enough and expectedly revolted. The first notable battle of the Gothic War took place outside Marcianople in the province of Thracia. This battle saw the Roman governor, Lupicinus, utterly defeated by the Goths. The war quickly ballooned out of control when more and more tribes joined in the revolt and even invited some Huns to cross the Danube River to attack the Romans. Despite the fact that most of the Eastern Empire's forces were still tied down in Asia, and the Western Empire, under the leadership of Valentinian's eldest son Gratian, was dealing with their own barbarian invasion, the Goths were prevented from taking Constantinople and expanding the scope of the war momentarily. Finally, in 378, Valens was able to extract himself and his army from Antioch and hastily marched to Constantinople. Upon reaching the capital, Valens was cautioned by his generals to await reinforcements from the west before engaging the Goths. Luckily for Valens, such reinforcements were already on their way, as Gratian sent word that he had defeated the barbarians in his lands and urged Valens to await for him to arrive. Unfortunately for Valens, there was one voice that spoke louder than those urging patience. This voice was the voice of the people of Constantinople, who blamed Valens for the Gothic invasion and mocked him for appearing more timid than his co-Augustus and nephew Gratian. The people's voice eventually won out, and on August 9th of 378, Valens met the Gothic armies at the Battle of Adrianople. A contemporary account of the battle is given to us by the historian Ammianus Marcellinus. In it, he sets the scene for the most pivotal single battle we have covered since Plataea back in episode 3, for which the Serpent Column commemorates. On the 6th of August, Valens's army was camped near Adrianople when their scouts reported that a Gothic army of 10,000 was marching towards the city. The emperor's response was to dig in and wait for his enemy to arrive. On the 8th of August, the Goths became aware of the Roman camp and sent a negotiator to broker a deal. The terms of the deal were that the Goths all across Thrace would stop their destructive rampage in return for what Valens had originally promised them: lands and safety from the Huns. Of course, the logical decision would be to take this offer. There was plenty of land in the empire that needed to be inhabited, and a Gothic ally could help repulse invaders without sacrificing Roman lives. All this on top of the fact that Valens would not have to fight a battle at Adrianople, which could go either way. However, too much damage had already been done to Roman property and Roman pride by the Goths' revolt, and so Valens rejected the peace offer. A factor weighing on the emperor's decision to risk battle was his calculation of manpower that put him at a significant advantage over the Goths. His army was 30,000 strong, with 5,000 of those being cavalry. Every man on the Roman side was a hardened veteran of the recent campaigns in the east and against the barbarians. Valens's scouts informed him that the Goths had roughly 1/3 of this number, and as always, the Roman arrogance played a role in underestimating the fighting ability of these men. The reality was a little different than what these scouts had reported. The Gothic forces consisted of two armies. One was led by the chief of the Therving Goths, named Fritigern. Fritigern had a deep history with Valens. When the emperor first crossed the Danube in 367 to fight the Goths that had attempted to aid the usurper, Fritigern had asked him to help oust his rival leader among the Therving. Valens complied, and in return Fritigern converted to Arian Christianity. Later, it would be Fritigern who approached the emperor asking for asylum from the invading Huns. It is only the cruelty and corruption of Valens's governors that turned Fritigern against him, and now pitted these past allies against each other outside Adrianople. The other army was led by Alatheus and Saphrax, co-chiefs of the Gruthungi Goths. Their people had slipped into Roman lands when the borders were opened to the Therving tribe. Their illegal inhabitation of Thrace and Moesia was used as justification of the mistreatment of all the Goths. Combined, these two armies numbered around 20,000, with modern and contemporary historians disagreeing on how prevalent cavalry were. It turns out the scouts had only encountered Fritigern's forces when they made their report to Valens, so he had no idea that there were almost double the number of Goths now arrayed against him. On the 9th of August, Valens made the fateful decision to attack the Gothic encampment located just north of Adrianople. He was anxious to defeat his enemies before Gratian's troops arrived, which he was informed would be any day now. He needed to prove that as the senior Augustus, he did not need the help of his nephew to defeat this ragtag mob of barbarians. The march from the Roman camp to the Gothic one was about 8 miles long, with no roads to cut through the rough terrain. So by the time the two armies had formed positions, the Romans were exhausted and dehydrated. The Goths' main priorities were to delay the start of the battle so that their cavalry could return from foraging, and to protect their wagon train, which included valuables they had plundered, and their families. To stall the Romans, Fritigern opened negotiations for his surrender. This tactic was effective in delaying the bulk of the Roman forces, but there were some errant units that attacked without orders from the emperor. These units were small enough to be repulsed by the Gothic infantry, until the entire Roman left wing got fed up with the obvious ruse and pushed all the way to the wagon circle. Then, like a scene out of the Lord of the Rings movies, the Gothic cavalry arrived just at Fritigern's most dire moment. They had returned from their foraging mission to see the bulk of the Roman army bearing down on their women and children. Like a wave crashing over the rocks, the Gothic horsemen plunged into the fray and forced the Romans to retreat to the base of a hill. But this terrain made further retreat impossible, and the rout turned into a slaughter. Only the coming of darkness of night stopped the killing, but by that time over 2/3 of the Roman forces, 20,000 men, would never leave the field outside Adrianople. Among the fallen was the Emperor Valens himself. His guard had abandoned him during the panic that the Gothic cavalry had inspired. By the time the battle was over, and they returned to search for their leader, there was no trace of him. Valens would not be buried with his brother and predecessors in the Church of the Holy Apostles. We will end this episode with the death of Valens. The Battle of Adrianople is marked by some historians as the beginning of the end of the Western Roman Empire, and the fate of Constantinople will be uncertain leading into the next episode, as the road to the capital is now clear for the Goths. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.